Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session, the ABCs of DEI and EDIB, the acronym party over here, best practices in implicit bias and anti-racist training. I'm Jazmin Morales. I'm tuning in from Los Angeles, California, where I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Innovation and Community Impact over at the Colburn School. And I am humbled and privileged to be moderating this discussion with three brilliant colleagues. Kristal Pacific, who is my colleague in the Sphinx Lead program and is the Director for Social Equity and Grantmaking at Opera America. Christina Salgado, who is the Director for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion and Belonging Initiatives at the Juilliard School, and Vester Waters joining us from Interlochen as a multicultural recruitment officer. Thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation. I'm excited to dive into some juicy topics here. We'll be talking about what each of our institutions are doing in the area of anti-racist and implicit bias training, how that work is actually going, how our institutions are measuring success in this work, and talking all about metrics and data that play a role in this work. And we'll also be talking about what it means to be a person of color doing this work in major institutions throughout the country, and how institutions can best support people like us who are on the ground doing this important work. And so with that, I just want to begin by naming the context in which we're having this conversation. When we last saw each other a year ago at Sphinx in frigid Detroit, my favorite trip of the year, we didn't know that that would probably be our last gathering for a really long time. And my trip to Detroit was actually one of the last ones I took. And so, and it was certainly the last conference I attended in real life. So Sphinx has been holding that place in my heart since then. But we were in a different world. We didn't know what we would live through in the next year. And so I really want to just begin this conversation by acknowledging the year that we've all had, the pandemic that we are still living through. You know, calling in from Los Angeles, where I think we're still the nation's hotspot. It's certainly a tough time for all of us. The racial uprising we lived and fought through over the summer that has radically changed the nature of many of our roles, but has also, I think, brought new energy and momentum to this work in our sector. And so it's as much a challenge as it's been an opportunity. But you know, with that, I'd really love to begin and just check in with you all and see how you all are faring in the year 2021 as you navigate through this work. So Kristal, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, Jazmin. You know, yeah, Sphinx was my last in-person conference as well. And nothing could have prepared us, as you said, for the year we've had. But in prepping for this session, I had a moment to finally just take a second to reflect. And so that's kind of the mode of where I'm approaching this conversation. I am ready for action. And so that's ultimately how I'm feeling. But as I considered, how did I get here? You know, many folks were called to action after the summer we had, particularly after the murder of George Floyd in May. As a Black woman, the murder of Breonna Taylor in March in her home shook me to a point I can't even really put into words, because that was a moment when we also, related to the COVID-19 pandemic, began to shelter in place in our homes, the assumed safe place for all of us. But it was just proven that that's not the case for Black women. And so it began, as I thought about that, our homes are not safe places. Neither are our offices and neither are our art forms. So that re-realization, coupled with my fear and anger, led me to have to do something in my capacity. So I hearkened back to something one of my mentors, Carmen Morgan from Art Equity, says, and she says, when you see a bit of power on the floor, pick it up. And so that's what I did. Right in that moment, we had lost our previous EDI officer as he went on to the NEA, which is awesome. And I was already at offer America in a grant-making capacity. But I took this opportunity to begin conversations with our president and CEO about serving in this social equity sphere as well. And this is also, I want to take this moment to acknowledge the Sphinx family and the Sphinx Lead program, as I'm surrounded by incredible leaders of color who continuously affirm that we as leaders of color are the change that we've been waiting for. And so this moment has served as a call to action for all of us to step up, step out, and speak truth. And that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been seeing over the last year. Many folks have stepped up and taken the mantle, myself included, and that's where we're at. This is personal, this is real life, and we're here wanting to make change and positive impact.
Absolutely, and major kudos to you for taking that on at a time where many of our teams have even been constricted and our workloads, increase exponentially as we take on more and more of this work, as that was my experience certainly over the summer. Christina, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Jazmin. Hi, everyone. Christina Salgado at the Juilliard School. And, this question for me, as Kristal said, it's so personal, right? Everything that we've experienced over the course of this year, all those external forces between a pandemic that has been disproportionately affecting Black and Brown people to the racial reckoning that we saw this summer. Watching a divided nation through what was a very challenging election, the insurrection on the Capitol. I mean, it's been quite a year. And for me personally, where I'm at is finding that moment to ground myself, I think was really difficult and challenging in this work. I'm helping an institution move these efforts forward. I also exist as a Latina woman, and I had to, grapple with those two things. And that was really real for me. I think personally what I love being in an educational institution because I think I learn most being in the room with students. And I was recently a part of a community meeting where there were very challenging moments that came up throughout this meeting. And we were really talking through some of the occurrences that have happened that really need a truth and reconciliation process. And a student stepped into the space and said, I want us all to take 5 minutes to be with one another and to just breathe with one another. And he led this really beautiful meditation exercise where it felt, even though we're all on screens and we're all in different places and coming from all these different locations around the world, that we could just be a community in those moments and find that humanity. And so I think that, as Kristal mentioned, I'm ready for action. I think we've been ready for action for a long time. At the Juilliard School, I think that this was a moment of refocusing. We had laid a lot of foundational work in this arena, and we were able to take the time to be intentional and genuine about how we were going to continue in this process. But then as a person, you have to also find the balance as well, and when to take the moment to step away and to be with just you in response to the various things that are occurring with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christina. Bester.
Awesome. Definitely so glad to be here today, joining you from sunny Traverse City. I have some natural sun coming in through my window. But definitely, what a year, what a year. So much that we've experienced. And I feel like it has just brought us to a new place of strength within our institutions, within ourselves, and really addressing some of those needs and some of that trauma that has actually built up over the years, and that even some of our alumni or that some of our students have been harboring, and that have never actually been able to actually bring this to the surface. And so I'm really excited now. For me personally, African-American male, dreadlocks, low income area, west side of Detroit. And I've been provided this opportunity through the arts at Interlochen to provide these opportunities for students. And it's just so fulfilling. It's so fulfilling. But I think that sometimes we neglect that, working in this diversity space is really emotionally taxing. And you really have to practice like self-care and really just taking care of yourself as you do serve as an advocate or as you do serve as like a mediator for different situations. And I think that's so important. And I'm definitely glad that we're having this dialect, and I'm definitely glad to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Well, I'd love to just dive right in and get to some of the nuts and bolts here. I know many people in our audience are curious about what's actually happening in your institutions, specifically in the areas of institutional learning around anti-racist and unconscious bias training. So whoever wants to kick us off here, I'll leave that as a wild card, but we'd love to hear what you guys are up to.
I'm happy to pop in again. So I'll start just by some of the things that we have implemented as it relates to our educational curriculum. So we've implemented 9 new courses within the past 5 years, and these include history of race and racism, indigenous literature, Latin American history, Middle Eastern literature, and also race, place, and American history. And so we also wanted to focus on the academic side of things. Sometimes in history, we see, certain ethnicities highlighted, but others neglected. And so we wanted to ensure that there was some equality as it relates to our academic portion of campus, as well as different compositions and theater and casting within our performances, because we also want that to be representative of our population, and also just broadening the spectrum of some of those great composers and artists as well. We've done citizen artistry training held with Eric Booth. So Interlochen is very much focused on being citizen artists and going into that community and giving back and creating that culture of artists. We've also had I currently head the Multicultural Working Group, which focuses on providing opportunities for marginalized communities. And one thing that I love about that group, our Dean of Enrollment Management, Katie Llewellyn, when she talked to me about the group, she said, know that you're not alone in this work. Know that, you're kind of like our point person, but know that you aren't alone. Know that if you have questions, you can come to me. And that felt so good to know that, hey, you might be the point person, but know that you're not alone. And so I think that was excellent as well. In addition, we've had xenophobia training. We have community meetings. We had over 500 students that we were fortunate enough to have on campus in person this year. And every Wednesday we have a community meeting in which students are able to voice concerns about social issues or artistic issues, and it really keeps us on one accord within our Interlochen community. And I think that's another great place that Interlochen has really made a lot of implementations and changes. And even as it relates to recruitment, not just saying, we're going to work to provide these opportunities, but saying, and furthermore, if they have financial difficulty, here's where you can see how many scholarship dollars we have in case these students want to come, but maybe can't afford it. Maybe finances are a hindrance. So also putting, your money where your mouth is. Some people want to say, oh, we're about the work of diversity and we support the vision, but you don't want to put your money where your mouth is. So I would definitely say that is another great thing that we've done here at Interlochen.
I'll jump in just to say that I'm really inspired by all the work you're doing, Vester. That sounds really awesome. And, when you said this idea of not being alone, I think that's so key. Although, we're the ones that hold these titles, we cannot do this work alone. And similarly, I facilitate what is now called the Racial Justice Opera Network, which are a number of people of color from the field of opera that come together to help advise us as an organization, as representatives from the field, Since that is a deficit we have internally in our organization, this is an opportunity to bring folks in. So that's something I think is really important. If you don't have it, seek it outside. So that's something that we've done. And with the Racial Justice Offer Network, we have devised a survey. It's going to be a field-wide survey in which we are getting demographic data from administrators and trustees working in the opera field at companies. We did it internally at Opera America, and we're going to do it field-wide as well, just to have data as a snapshot in this moment that can help us chart the path forward to say, this is where we are, and we're trying to go, to a different place and vision forward. So that's one of the major initiatives we've spearheaded thus far. But I would say, one of the most effective things that my institution has done has been to invest in me in this role. And what I mean by that is that, they have supported me as I pursued a diversity and inclusion certificate from Cornell University. They support me, in the Sphinx Lead program that takes me away from the office a couple of times a year, and trainings with Art Equity, as someone to become an expert on staff in this arena. And I think that's really important. And as such, our next step is to get all of our team on board. We will be engaging a firm, an equity firm, to come consult with our administrators and trustees as a next step. But it was such a moving thing for this organization to say, let's start here. Let's start with investing in one person to make a difference. And I think that's really powerful.
Thank you, Kristal and Vester, for sharing where you're at with your institution. It's really inspiring. Over the course of the 2 years that I've been at Juilliard, I've seen the commitment of EDIB kind of continue to grow into really intentional action. Initially for us, the work began in collaboration with consultants who helped us build a foundation for the work to come. So this really began with a listening tour where they went throughout our community, students, faculty, and staff, and they facilitated these interviews where individuals could share sort of their insights, how they were feeling about the EDIB efforts currently at the institution, the challenges, the gaps, any programming that might be working but needed to be expanded, things like that. Following that tour, there was survey results that were also looked at. And that really allowed us to analyze and to look for trends, and then to match that up to what we heard in the listening tour. And this was actually before my time, so they had engaged in this previous to my arrival, and they then created my position. And one of the first things I was handed was that report. And what was great about that was we were able to clearly see sort of areas in which we really needed to focus our efforts. And the first area was training. It was all related to workshops and learning opportunities. And this came from all of our constituents. So whether you're a student, faculty, or staff member, we were hearing that staff and faculty really needed training in order to engage in the dialogue that students were ready to have. So that was a key area. In addition to that, student support services, but specifically for BIPOC students and international students, we have a pretty high international population, it's around 30%. And lastly, as we all can imagine, being in an educational institution, broadening the curriculum and the rep. So at the beginning of 2019, we actually began a series of foundational workshops for the faculty and staff. And the process that we went through was in collaboration with those external consultants. We really talked through what was necessary for our community. So we had created a task force as well. That task force was comprised of our administrative and artistic leaders. And the way that group was put together was really thinking through, okay, we need the gatekeepers in this moment so that we can find a way for us to make this training really accessible to all of their various departments and divisions. Just as a note, at Juilliard, we also have, in addition to music, we have dance and drama. And so we're working through a lot of different nuances, all stemming from the same issues, but definitely in different ways. And so I think what was really critical about that workshop was it was created by our community, for our community. And so there are really specific examples of things that occurred at Juilliard utilized in that. And we talked through power, access, privilege, our positionality in artistic spaces, in addition to unconscious bias and intention versus impact and things of that nature. Now, this was a 2-hour session where I think it was a great start to starting the dialogue, but really we need to build on those efforts. So that occurred over the course of a year where we were really working and facilitating these workshops with our faculty and staff. And I should note that we developed it in consultation with consultants, but we actually internally trained a group of community members who we knew were allies and really passionate about EDIB, and we facilitated those conversations. So it was really a big community effort. One thing I'll mention on this is, like, again, this was the beginning. It was really a first step, an initial step in beginning the dialogue. After the summer occurred, and as we all kind of mentioned at the top in the racial reckoning, and I have to acknowledge again that it was unfortunate that it really took this moment for many institutions to step out and to make statements. But at Juilliard, we really looked inward and assessed where we were in the work. And then we wanted to make sure we restated those commitments, but we also wanted to be sure that those commitments and those intentions were fully recognized in the actions that we were taking. And so that, of course, began with an acknowledgement of the wrongs and the pain that we had caused, and then really a refocusing and realizing, that we needed to say things more boldly. We needed to be really intentional and genuine, and most importantly, we needed to be transparent with our community about where we were in the progress of it all. So I really saw our dialogues and our conversations get significantly deeper in that moment. And this is for us when the switch came where we began talking about anti-racism. Up until that point, our work had really been kind of under the umbrella of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But this was really the first time that we started having those deeper dialogues. Anti-racism had come up, but never in this really, really intentional way that I saw, in the summer months. We acknowledge that we're ultimately conditioned to, in many ways, to see people's place in society based on social identities and specifically race, and we had to call that out. And the biggest thing is, in our institutions, our policies and practices perpetuate this. And so we need to figure out the way to be actively anti-racist. And so for us, what was really helpful and a visual that I think has been really useful, and my colleague Weston Strott was the one who had shared this resource with us. Many might know the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. But she kind of describes anti-racism using this visual of a conveyor belt at an airport, and you stand on that conveyor belt and it pushes you forward, right? So if you're complacent and you do nothing, you're still actively moving forward. And if you're walking with it, then that would be active racist behavior. But it's not enough to turn around, right, and to say, no, this is racist. So you have to actually walk against that. And when you think about those conveyor belts, I don't know if anyone ever as a kid tried to run in the opposite direction. There's a lot of effort that you have to put in if you're trying to get off of that conveyor belt moving in the opposite direction. And so for me, I think this was like a really, really helpful visual and really solidified for us in our community what we were trying to accomplish. Just to take it a step further, what we decided to do is to create opportunities for more community organizing, so locally within our community. So we had groups forming, working groups forming, anti-racism committees, things of that nature, all in these little pockets that my office has helped facilitate. And what's been really wonderful about that is we have students, faculty, staff all in the same room, and we're trying to create a process, a dynamic where we're leaving, power out of it, right? We all have an equal seat at the table, and so there's some of us who are giving up power and others who are able to take some of that power. And we're looking at those practices and policies that are in place, and we're trying to assess and to interrogate them so we can determine, what are the things that we need to adjust and we need to change, or we need to really say, what, this is an alternative. And so that's kind of where our anti-racism work is currently. It's definitely in progress. You know, a concrete example of that is we have a group that's looking at our non-discrimination and harassment policy, also helping us to build out our bias response if occurrences happen. And then we also have a group that's looking at the prevention side of that. You know, we ultimately in the end really hope that we can prevent those occurrences from happening, although we recognize they will continue to happen. So that's, you know, I think for us, you know, where we're at. I think the last thing I will mention is that, you know, we are at a place where we have to be in those meetings and those moments where we can say, like, wait a second, you know, this is the anti-racist idea that would help us to create a more equitable environment, so that we can like strive truly for where we're not in a situation where access and opportunity to our field is a privilege, but it's ultimately a fundamental right.
A resounding yes to all of that. Thank you all for sharing. I think this is all just so inspiring to hear all this great work happening around the nation led by you all. It's in very good hands. So now we know what you're doing. I'd love to know how that's going, and more specifically, you know, if any, what are the biggest challenges that you might be facing around this work and right now? Kristal, what are you facing these days?
I think the biggest challenge is, I mean, Opera America is a complex institution. We're a national service organization. And so, you know, our ultimate mandate is to serve. And we're a membership organization as well. So we have a number of opera companies around the country who are members. And I think I would say one of our greatest challenges is being a leader, trying to lead the effort in this direction for the field, as well as in the organization. And you know, that, I think that's where a lot of the work is going to happen. And that's why, you know, we're moving forward in making sure that our staff and trustees will be trained and continue to make this a priority, because, you know, we realize we can't serve from an empty cup. We need to make sure that we are full and are examples of how this work can be done. Part of our process will be to, as Christina was talking about, is to document this process publicly, to share lessons learned with the field. As an example, you know, there's no one way to do this work, but, you know, just having an example in an institution like ours with such a national profile is you know, it's our mandate at this moment. So yeah, I think it's just that relationship between internal work and external work, and we have to do them both at the same time. We can't choose to neglect one or the other.
Absolutely. Esther, how about at Interlochen?
Definitely. So I think that one of the things that we are focusing on is definitely myth busting. Even in the work of Eric Booth, he refers to arts as like the art club, which is basically kind of like this elite group of artists. And, you know, sometimes Interlochen has been lumped into that perception of the art club. And so I think and even in my recruitment with families, they really wonder, like, you know, do you have to be Mozart birthday was the other day, so I'll use Mozart. But do you have to be like born a Mozart, you know, to go to Interlochen? Like, what do you guys look for? Like, how is the competition? And we always just tell them, you know, put your best foot forward. Don't worry about the competition. Don't worry about others. Focus on what you're doing. So I definitely say that one struggle is definitely myth busting as it relates to our programs and our offerings here at Interlochen. I think that one other thing that was touched on actually in a conference offered by NAIS is when we talked about the location of some of our institutions. So some of us are located in a more metropolitan area. Maybe we are in, Las Vegas or New York or something like that. And Traverse City is a beautiful area, but we are literally at the top of Michigan. We're nestled between two beautiful lakes, but we're right by Canada. So sometimes we do have that concern of like, parents that are worried about sending their student, to a boarding school in northern Michigan, in a rural area. And I think that sometimes that can also be sometimes something that we struggle with. But ultimately, I would say with the work, our communities are ecstatic to see Interlochen more visible in the community. I think that sometimes, you can feel especially for an organization as prestigious as Interlochen, you could easily take an approach of arrogance to say, well, we don't really have to work that hard. People know who we are. They know what we do. You could easily do that, but to take those steps and say, hey, we want to be a part of the work. We want to be visible. We want to be involved. I think that just really goes with, breaking down some of those myths, and just moving beyond, Christina talked about, your intention. And that's so important, with the work is actually your intention. And I think that that has helped us really move beyond, some of those barriers that we do face, and really producing tangible results. And we actually had a diversity webinar, and we actually have one coming up next month as well. But we had a parent on, and they shared, I visibly seen on campus that Interlochen has changed. You're embracing more students. You're growing, as I mentioned earlier, academically. You're implementing new programs. And to have people, we see it. We're looking at numbers. We're looking at data. But for someone to say, I see it, that means more to me than any spreadsheet, than any graph can ever say. For someone to say that I see what you're doing and that it's working, and that means so much more to me than anything else. So I think ultimately we do face some obstacles, some adversity, but in the end, it's just about your intention and staying consistent in doing the work.
That's amazing. And to have that feedback, I'm sure just feels like so awesome after this. So thank you, Vester, for sharing. Christina, I'm curious to know what challenges you're facing at Juilliard. And I think specifically, I'm curious now that the conversation has sort of accelerated or gained more momentum, especially around shifting towards an anti-racist lens, like has that made the work more challenging or easier? Like how has that changed the timbre of the conversation?
Yeah, I think that, ultimately the bottom line is this work is very, very challenging. And from what I'm seeing is that although, as I mentioned before, like the external forces that are really, and the systems that are at play are all affecting us, and we know what those systems are. They're sort of different among the different divisions, among different constituents, among, the students versus the faculty versus the staff. So there's sort of a lot of nuance that's necessary to look at here. In addition to that, I would say that there's a level of this work that is really on the individual, and everyone is coming at this with a different lens, with different perspectives, and so finding a way to kind of have that common language to talk about this can be difficult and challenging. And then also kind of changing up those dynamics, like I talked a little bit about the working group model. And I remember one of the first meetings we had where we sat together in our Zoom room, and we talked through what we were striving for, the environment we were striving for, and we tried to put that down on paper so that we could capture that and really create a place where we're all coming to this and we have an equal say and spot at the table. And that was a different approach. We hadn't really done it in that way before. And so I think there's always those kind of growing pains as you're trying new things. But ultimately, what I'm seeing is that it's really opened up communication channels within our community. And we're seeing that, there's this kind of excitement in the community that they have a role, right? That everyone has a place in this. So challenges, but also beauty, I think, in all of this work.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. So now I'd love to kind of along these lines, this is a two-part question. So how does your organization define and measure success in this area? I know it's a big loaded one, but whoever's brave enough to jump in first. How do you define and measure success?
I mean, I think it's a big question about this is who determines success, which is interesting to me, and maybe another panel discussion. But in terms of like the tactical and tangible things that we're doing, you know, I think that having a sense of your demographic data is really important. Really understanding that across the various constituents that you have at your institution. You know, looking at climate data or climate survey data, and of course, you know, looking at the trends that you see there. Another thing that we've sort of put into place, which is fairly new, now that we have a bias response office, we'll be looking at the number of reports and then like the category that they're all associated to, whether it was a microaggression or something that's larger, like a, you know, an act of discrimination. And so we're trying to make sure that we understand also the conflict that's happening in our community. I think also, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about ways in which we offer those moments for truth and reconciliation. You know, how do you, in an educational institution, we think a lot about this with alumni, you know, who their experiences has happened, and they're still a part of our institution, but in a different way. And so I think that's an area that we're embarking on and we're thinking through more critically. But you know, this is such a tough question because, you know, ultimately at the end, it's like who really defines success here. And I think this is a journey. That's another key element to this is like, you know, there's not sort of, we don't want this checkbox approach. So it's not like, okay, we did this, we sit back, we say done. Instead, it's sort of understanding your data and then, you know, looking at those trends, deciding your next steps, adapting and changing as needed as you see those trends. So I feel like it's this like ongoing process. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, so I'm sorry for that.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know it's a sticky one, but Vester or Kristal, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say, I just want to second what you said, Christina. I mean, it's a complex question, and I think that ultimately success is a moving target. And, you know, having the data, as you said, is so important. I love that you brought up the idea of qualitative data as well. What is the climate like? What are people saying? How are they feeling? And that being a major part of the change making as well. And that's an initiative, that's our next initiative that we'll be doing as well on a field-wide level. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, according to census.gov in 2019, 60% of people in the US identify as white alone. So that leads you to the assumption that 40% are BIPOC or of color, non-white. And our institutions don't look like that. So there's reasons for that, you know, that in their inception, in the way that they were envisioned, you know, many of us, especially in this panel, were not in the room. We weren't even a part of that plan. And so now that we are now, you know, many of us are becoming, getting these positions and getting power. One, let's diversify even on the superficial level. Yes, we need our institutions to have more diversity. Our institutions need to look like what our country looks like. That's point blank, period. But then that next step of belonging, of sharing power, of making sure that as you bring in all these brilliant folks, that they truly have a voice and are now the center of what the new vision for the institution is going to look like. And so in many ways, while the pandemic, of course, is a beyond crisis that is devastating to all of us in various ways, it's also an opportunity for all of us to sort of start from scratch. You know, this is an opportunity for us that are in these positions or gaining these positions, for our leaders to step up and say, no more, we want to do something differently moving forward. And we want that power to be shared with the entire representative of the entire community. So again, that's a moving target. You know, the climate changes over time. And so success will always, you know, be defined differently as we move forward. But I think ultimately it's the goal to be more reflective of our nation.
Awesome. And I can definitely pop in. I agree completely with both Christina and Kristal. And it's hard because it's like, who defines, you know, success, and what does that look like? And I think that for us, definitely just holding ourselves accountable. Again, everybody is responsible for this work. And so even when you are, you know, that person, I think that everyone is responsible. And we also have a board of trustees who are committed to seeing us engage and also improve. And as I mentioned earlier, they have funds to support those initiatives as well. So that also makes a huge difference. For those who may not be familiar with Interlochen, we do offer both a camp and our boarding arts academy. And so I'll definitely share just a quick data regarding our academy. So currently we are 56% more diverse than we were in 2016-17. So when I talk about that change that parents show when they talk about the actual visible change, that is a visible change. And so a huge change. And also for 2020, our applicant pool was 60% more diverse than it was in 2016-17. And so I think definitely thinking about the quantitative side of things, being in admission, you have to look at the numbers. And even when you're out recruiting and things like that, you know, that's something that families are going to ask you. They want to know, what does your student body look like? Where am I sending my kid? And so that's something that we don't want to place, you know, a whole lot of focus on, but in the end, that's something that people are going to ask us about. That's something that's important, you know, to a parent that is sending their child away. And so ultimately, I think that is some of the ways that we measure success. Always working to be a leader in the arts, and just really setting that standard. And ultimately, as I share, speaking with our students, we also have student organizations, affinity spaces and things like that. And just talking to them, just simply checking in to ask them, how is life for you? How are you? Just checking on them to ask them, how are you? And I think that makes a huge difference, because I mean, you may not be in a metropolitan area. Your campus may be 99.9% whatever ethnicity. If that 0.1%, if they have a community within themselves, then that makes it all worthwhile. That makes it feel like you are not in the fight alone. So I would definitely say, you know, creating that space, and just checking on people, just actually asking, like, aside from looking at the quantitative, like, hey, is what we're doing working? You know, just asking them, what could we do? And I think that's another great way to measure success, is just from getting feedback from, you know, your students or your staff, or, you know, the individuals within your organization.
Yes, thank you for naming that, Buster. I think that's so, it's often a neglected data point, right? Like, how are people actually doing? How are they, the people who we're seeking to serve, and whose, you know, whose representation we're seeking to grow, how are they feeling about this, right? And so I think focusing equally on qualitative and quantitative data is I think the key here, and sounds like something especially Interlochen is doing really well. So congrats to you all over there. You know, when you have a mom stopping you and being like, hey, things are different, that's the real metric of success, honestly. Okay, so to wrap up our time here as a group before we open up to general questions, I'd love to close with a kind of tricky question for this group, which is, should EDI be someone's job? Like, should that be a concentrated responsibility in an organization? I know there are lots of pros and cons here as it relates to, does this responsibility lie with everyone? Should it be centralized? So I'm curious to know how you all are thinking about this. As to, you know, especially for organizations who are maybe considering creating a role specifically around EDI.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be someone's role. That's why I stepped up to take it. I think that this role is so unique in that it offers, it is centralized, and it offers perspective to look at things from so many different levels. And to look at the organization as a whole, to see the blind spots, and to you know, make suggestions of how to move forward. And you know, something that you kind of mentioned in the preview that we've been talking about for a while is, you know, should this role be held by a person of color? And you know, I think today, in this moment, I say that it should, certainly with lots of support. But, you know, there is something about having a person with lived experience that adds something to this role, and I think ultimately makes it more effective. In addition, there's a level, you know, of trust that I know I have with my colleagues of color. They know that in this work, I am centering them. And I think that's important. And, you know, we talked about this. This is a lot of labor, both emotionally and professionally. But it's one that those who choose to, and I do want to make the caveat, like, don't just ask your person of color on staff to do this. There are people who are willing to do it and to step up, but don't tokenize your employees of color, please. But those who are, and those of us who serve in these roles here, we're willing to do so. And I think for me, you know, why I am, is my mantra is nothing about us without us. So I think ultimately, yes, let it be someone's role. But every single person at an institution, of course, especially the leadership, needs to be held accountable as well. And I think that's where the training that we've been talking about comes into place. Everyone in the organization needs support as well, and in order for them to then be held accountable. So I think that's why the investment is necessary on an annual basis and for the long term.
Absolutely. And one kind of final follow-up to that is, how can an institution best support a person of color in an EDI role? Start by sending them to Sphinx Lead. Yay. Go ahead, Buster.
Okay, so this was kind of a three-part question. So the first is the role. Okay, so even as I mentioned earlier, I think it is good. I think it's good to have a point person for this work. As I mentioned, it is extremely emotionally taxing. So kind of skipping to the third part of the question, I think just checking in to see how we are. I think naturally I have kind of like this demeanor of like, I always have to be strong, like don't show any form of like weakness or anything like that. But sometimes I am sad, and like sometimes I am like emotionally heavy, and sometimes I'm not even gonna say it. Like I just need somebody to just check in on me and just say, hey, I know you're doing great work, but like, how are you? Like not how are your initiatives going, but like, how is your life going? And I think sometimes that really helps for me. In addition, we do have, even though we do have like primary point people for diversity, we do have the Committee on Inclusive Excellence. And our president, Trey Devi, he would come in and actually sit down with us and just see, you know, as many things as he has going, for him to sit down with our committee and just say, hey, I want to check on you guys. I want to see what we can do. I want to know what we're not doing. That really means a lot. So definitely, I guess I'm alluding more to the support, because when you give us the support, and even Kristal with getting, you know, the diversity certificate, like that's fantastic. That's what we need. We need support from our institutions, so that we can do the work. And kind of piggybacking on, if it should be a person of color, you know, I really grapple with that question, because my initial thought was, yeah, of course it should be. But, you know, kind of just being the advocate, I would say it depends. I think it depends, because just because that person is of color, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're number one, their education, and number two, their experiences are gonna be relative to your students and the background of what they come from. So I would say yes, it's almost ideal that it will be a person of color. Me personally, yes, I would say it should be. But I would go further to say that it depends. It depends on their background. It depends on their, you know, relatability to your students, and what they'll be able to bring to the table. And so I think that's kind of my answer, my canned answer for that.
Totally. Christina, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm recognizing time, and I think Kristal and Vester have shared really incredible points on this. In terms of the role, I do think having a dedicated role is valuable, and specifically like the office that sits in, or how as an institution you're supporting that office. So for me personally, I sit in the office of the president, and I think that was a really intentional choice. In addition to that, having those support systems in place, where we have committees, we have working groups, so that we recognize that this work is not just in one place, it's actually in everything, every day, for everyone. So I think that that's really necessary. In terms of supporting people in these types of roles, I think, Vester is 100% correct on like just having someone to check in with you can mean a lot. And also just in those meetings, like having allies who are there and kind of supporting the perspective that you're sharing that sometimes might have not been thought about. I think I'm really fortunate at Juilliard. We've seen quite a shift in the diversity specifically of the staff. And so I think I'm really lucky in that space, because I feel like I do have a community that we're really working towards this equitable and inclusive community. So that's really exciting. The question around, should this be a person of color? I think I grapple with that as well. I think both Kristal and Vester pointed out some really good points. Sometimes it feels like everyone has a role in this, right? So let's figure out how to make that work. But other times I think the personal experience and then the ability to connect specifically in our cases with students of color or colleagues of color makes a huge difference. So I think there's sort of pros and cons, and I don't know if we have the answer on what's preferred.
Absolutely. And I'll just add, as a more tactical, beyond just like checking in with people doing this work, I have found that, especially over the last year, I've invested a lot of like my post-tax salary to my own care in navigating this work, whether that's through hiring executive coaches or meditation coaches or paying for therapy. There's a lot of that comes at a price. And so factoring that into compensation packages might also be something to consider here for anyone listening. Okay, great. So let's jump into some audience questions. So for Kristal or anyone else, how do you or have you implemented anti-racist or implicit bias training for donors? And I think I would even expand this question to include like audiences or families of students. I think anyone who's sort of peripheral in our constituency. Has anyone implemented any of this learning to people beyond our immediate faculty, staff members?
Since I was mentioned, I'll say that we have not. So something to consider. I know, Christina, you have gone quite far with who's received this training.
We haven't done anything with donors specifically. You know, a lot of our focus has been with, you know, we might talk with development staff about, like, if they're in a situation, how might they navigate that situation, and ways in which they can either model language that should be utilized and things like that. But we haven't gone to the extent of, you know, training sort of beyond the people who are in our building regularly, meaning faculty, staff, students.
Yeah, and as I mean, I think someone said this earlier, like it's personal investment as well. So we would hope that folks are doing that, especially donors who can do that on their own.
Exactly, and then sharing out, like, we're constantly sharing out our messaging, and I think that that's important, is just for that to be clear too.
Just to pop in really quickly, I'm not completely certain about actual training, but I know that we do have a student organization called the Diversity Advocates. And so these students are really like on the ground, on campus, really aware of like how the students are feeling. And they did have an opportunity to present in front of our board. And some of the material presented at the board were the foundation for some of these working groups and some of these task forces that we were able to implement. So I would definitely say that counts for a lot, and just the board being receptive to what the students had to say.
Absolutely. And I think that will be a next step that we all collectively move towards, which is how can we engage peripheral constituents in these conversations. And especially, you know, we don't have any orchestras or presenting organizations necessarily represented here, but especially audiences, you know, I think bringing them into these conversations that we're having internally will be important. Okay, so how would you suggest a majority and historically white organization in a largely white community recruit and empower BIPOC staff members without tokenizing and marginalizing them? Great question. Kristal, were you going to jump in?
No, I just had one more thought about the previous question. Sorry, this question.
Oh,
this
okay,
one's really hard. That's but the previous question is that, yes, the one thing we do that I assume engages our donors, et cetera, this is a topic of conversation. We are a convener. We regularly have programs, forums, et cetera, that addresses this as a primary issue, whether you're working in development or a donor, whether you're working in marketing, et cetera. This is a primary issue that we address with all of our constituencies. So I guess that is one way. It's not formal training, and I didn't think of it as such, but we are certainly engaging the community at large in prioritizing this moving forward. But yeah, the second question, that's a great one. I mean, yeah. Look outside of your community. I mean, I guess that has to be the answer, right? You know, the Zoom world has opened up access. You know, I've connected with people I would have never have before with much more frequency. And I think that we are starting to see a more global perspective and access to different people. And so this is probably a great time to have the opportunity to meet folks that you don't regularly see in your grocery store. So I think, yeah, just continuing to go out to things and see events and be in the various conversations that are happening at institutions that you are passionate about, you might meet some folks who would be interested in joining your team.
Yeah, I might also add that Sphinx is a great resource in general, just to know more people who are doing this work. But I'll also add that it might be, or invite you to consider hiring in a cluster, because oftentimes when, you know, you're hiring one person of color into your white institution, it can, you know, it can be a difficult adjustment for that person who is hired. So, you know, giving them a community to step into where they will feel supported, I think will be really important in finding the right person who can thrive long term in your institution. So with a minute left, I'd love to just open it back up to you all for any closing thoughts, or maybe a question that you want to leave the audience with, or a resource. It's just been such a delight talking to you all, and you have shared so much, and I thank you for being so candid with your knowledge and experience. And with that, I'll let you close with a final thought. Christina, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think that I would say for white folks who are in these institutions is to really listen. I think that that's really, really critical, and to take responsibility for the role that you have in this as well, and sort of expanding your resources and your dialogue and conversation around this. I think for all the BIPOC folk, I would say, take care of yourself. Make sure that, as you're pushing through with these various efforts, which are so needed, that you're also taking the care that you need for yourself. I think that those would be my two little bits of advice.
Okay, I'll pop in. I just have just a couple of really quick points. I think the first one would be avoid a laissez-faire approach. So know that doing nothing is an action. So if you're thinking that not taking any action is better, it's not. That's still an action. So keep that in mind, and be and be precise in your intentions of what you're doing, and be genuine in what you're doing. I kind of mentioned earlier, check in on your students, check in on your staff, see how we're doing, and be a support. We might not always say it, we might not always seem like it, but there have been days I've went home and just cried, just from, the stress of what's been going on. Everybody's not going to tell you that. Some people won't admit that. But I think in order to, do this type of work, you really open yourself up to a vulnerability. And that is what helps to push the institution forward. But know that even that is hard, because you wouldn't be quick to let someone read your diary. And I think last but not least, I know we're running low on time. There is a quote that says, diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being invited to dance. And I always like to take that a step further by saying, well, what type of music are we playing? Are we square dancing? Because I don't know how to square dance. If we're doing the Cupid Shuffle, I can do the Cupid Shuffle. So in the event that you have invited me to the party, you did ask me to dance, and I still need help. I just need you guys to be that help, be that additional support in these efforts.
Just picking, I'll Cupid Shuffle with you, and I'll learn to square dance too, But I just also wanted to bring in a quote into the room from Toni Morrison, and which she says, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Someone says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. And so I just leave us with, let us not be distracted by racism. Let us be held accountable and committed to doing the work. We can do this in our lifetime. I know there's been talk about this taking time, but it can happen in our lifetime, and that is our mandate.
Indeed. Thank you all so much.